Our first speaker, Mr. Matcheri Keshavan, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical Center, has come to indulge in an intellectual journey of rethinking schizophrenia. Please welcome him on stage.
Imagine being defined by a word that is so stigmatizing that it drowns out your entire identity. That is how a young woman, let's call her Maria, that I took care of almost 30 years ago when I was a newly minted psychiatrist. And she was a second-year medical student, and she had begun hearing voices. And the voices got louder, and her thoughts became more jumbled, and her mind felt confused. She was not much older than many of you high school students, and I did a full evaluation, and I gave her a diagnosis of schizophrenia. She was speechless for some time. And then she said, this is not moving forward. Sorry about that. So she asked me the question, am I psychotic? Am I crazy? Am I going to kill someone? Is this incurable? And she asked the question, am I having a split mind or a split brain personality and so forth? So these are the kinds of questions that come to our minds when we hear about this brain disease called schizophrenia, which affects about 1% of the general population.
Can you talk into the mic, please?
So, this got me thinking as to, and she even went on to ask me, can you give me a different diagnosis? It feels like your diagnosis is like a sentence for me. So that got me really thinking as to whether we should really be thinking about this term schizophrenia and what does the public think about it. So a couple of years ago, we did a survey of over 1,100 participants, many of them people with the illness, and many of them family members, and a number of them policymakers, treatment providers, and so on. One thing that we found, which was quite striking, is that nearly 80% of the survey participants preferred to change the name schizophrenia. Only about 1/5 preferred to keep it. So that's quite a striking observation. And then we looked at the participant responses and we created a word cloud. And the biggest word that came up with that was the term stigma. And this is a term that refers to being leading to discrimination and also under treatment. Maria felt, there's no need for treatment for me because I don't have schizophrenia. I don't have psychosis. So many of them go untreated because of the stigma. So we did another study in which we asked the question, is schizophrenia or this term schizophrenic used like an adjective in the population? And often we use the term, the economy is diabetic or things like that, or the population, the politicians are schizophrenic and so on. So we asked a number of people, neutral raters, to rate tweets, over 2,000 tweets, which had the term schizophrenia or diabetic, and we found that the term schizophrenic had a significantly more negative connotation and also was inaccurate. And the stigma is not going away. A large national survey has shown recently that stigma is getting better for a number of psychiatric disorders, except schizophrenia. So, what are the aspects of schizophrenia that we know, and what are the myths about this illness? It's useful to know what schizophrenia is not. First of all, schizophrenia is not a brain split. And I'm going to talk to you more about what happens to the brain of individuals with this illness. There is no split in personality either. There is another condition called multiple personality disorder, which is different from schizophrenia. The person who defined the name schizophrenia over 100 years ago, a psychiatrist by name Eugene Bleuler, he himself believed that schizophrenia is not one disease. He thought that schizophrenia may be many diseases and more like a spectrum or a syndrome. So this is an evening on brain and its illnesses. So let's think about the brain. The human brain, consider that this is the most complicated system in the universe with over 100 billion nerve cells or neurons. And each neuron connects with thousands of other neurons through what we call synapses, as you see there. And each synapse communicates with, one neuron communicates with another neuron through what we call chemical messengers or neurotransmitters. And there are over 600 trillion synapses in the brain, and there are over 100 chemical messengers or neurotransmitters. So you can see how incredibly complex this system is. Now, what happens in schizophrenia? This is an illness that begins in late teenage years and early adulthood. And the thinking is that it may be a brain developmental disorder. And how does the brain develop? Brain develops by forming neurons, and the neurons make connections like synapses. And this happens during the period of adolescence. The adolescent brain is like a dense forest. And navigating the forest is hard because there are fewer roads. The way the brain develops is to create roads and thereby making the jungle not so dense. And that process is called synaptic pruning. And the current thinking is that what happens in schizophrenia is that there may be too many synapses that are trimmed out, leaving a condition where there are too few synapses. That's the current thinking about this illness. The second aspect of this illness is that these roads that connect the different parts of the brain, which we call axons, they are like a wiring diagram in the brain. The wiring diagram in the brain of individuals with schizophrenia tends to be much more sparse. What we call the connectome, the wiring diagram of the brain, becomes less dense as a result of this excessive synaptic pruning. And what you can see here is that neuronal traffic of the wiring diagram of the brain with trillions of synapses working together is what makes us who we are with our thoughts, feelings, and emotions and so forth. So there might be a problem with the integration of neurons and the circuits, which is what might cause this illness. The third aspect of this illness is, as I mentioned to you before, the brain is a machine with multiple neurotransmitters. And one particular neurotransmitter called dopamine might be working too much. And that might underlie the illness, but normally we all escape developing schizophrenia because we have multiple other neurotransmitters that are balancing it out, like glutamate, acetylcholine, serotonin, and so forth. And what might happen in this illness is an imbalance with there being too much dopamine, and perhaps this imbalance may be related to genetic risk. The fourth key point that I want to mention about this illness, going back to what Bloiler said 100 years ago, is that it may be a collection of multiple brain diseases. In fact, we examined that question by using machine learning, using biomarkers across thousands of people with psychotic illnesses, and we found that there may be biologically distinct subgroups, which we call biotypes, across the spectrum of illnesses. And these biotypes might differ in their response to treatment, in how they do over the course of time. Now, my key summary points are: first, the term schizophrenia is highly stigmatizing, and most people prefer to change the name. And secondly, schizophrenia is not a split mind or split personality problem, and it is probably a group of brain disorders with alterations in perceptions and thinking, perhaps due to a lack of connectivity of neurons, and perhaps due to an imbalance in neurotransmitter systems. So where do we go next? We asked our survey participants, what alternative names might you prefer if schizophrenia is not the optimal name for it? Two names that did much better than schizophrenia were, one is that it might be a Bloiler syndrome, just like we say Alzheimer's disease, Bloiler's disease or Bloiler syndrome. Another one was something to do with neuro in it, neurointegrative or neuroemotional integrative disorder. Even better was the name psychosis spectrum disorder, similar to autism spectrum conditions, which really says that it may be a group of conditions. And finally, one of our own patients actually came up with the word altered perception syndrome. She had not read the fact that in China already the official name of schizophrenia is changed to disorders of thought and perception, and in Japan to disorders of integration. So there are ways to go in terms of potentially thinking about schizophrenia in an alternative way. But there are skeptics. Some people, by this Shakespearean quote, summarizes it. Some people think that, the essence of the disease is not in its name. And Shakespeare said, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. However, that's not how our patients, like Maria, think. Maria said, I have to tell you this story. 25 years later, I came across Maria. I had lost touch with her after she dropped out of treatment from medical school. I saw her in a neuropsychiatry conference. She had graduated as a doctor. She had trained as a psychiatrist and was doing neuroscience research. I asked her, Maria, how are you doing? Do you still have those difficulties? She said, yes, I still hear voices, but I kind of go to my primary care doctor and he gives me a little bit of aripiprazole, a dopamine medicine. And so I asked her, what do you call your illness? She said, I call it a brain problem, a brain spectrum problem. I don't even call my medicine an antipsychotic. I call it a dopamine stabilizer. So Maria says something very, very important to us. A new name won't cure me, she said, but it might give me the dignity to face the world without being judged. So we need to really listen to millions of people around the world who have this condition, like Maria, who have this condition called schizophrenia, and really work together hand in hand with people who have the experience of the illness, family members of those with the illness, treatment providers, researchers, and think beyond the term schizophrenia. Because if you change the name, you change the narrative. Thank you.